Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the research that I did on my book, The Brink of Freedom, as David mentioned, and so let's get going. You know, the word freedom is ubiquitous today, as it has been since at least the 19th century, the 18th century, I should say. And if you ask an academic what it means, they'll likely give you a kind of abstract definition, such as the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. They might also support that definition by talking about a handful of elite European and American political theorists and philosophers who are famous for having written about concepts like freedom. That might speak of John Locke in the 17th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century, or G.W.F. Hegel in the 19th century. They might even talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Women into a decidedly male-dominated account of freedom, or someone like Simon Bolivar, who wrote Latin America into that account. But what did regular people think freedom meant during the very years those elites were writing their now well-read treatises? People who could not write or publish, particularly Black and Indigenous people in the Americas. That was the question that I tried to answer in my last book, The Brink of Freedom. And I started by researching two little known but very impactful 19th century social movements. First, the colonization of Liberia in West Africa by enslaved Black people from the US who were emancipated on the condition that they agree to be deported to Liberia to set up a colony there. And second, a massive uprising of indigenous Maya people on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico against the Creole or white Spanish minority, an uprising now typically called the Caste War, La Guerra de Castas. Both of these events unfolded between about in the middle of the 19th century. So I picked these social movements for a few reasons. First, they were and still are relatively unheralded outside Liberia and Mexico themselves. Second, despite not being talked about much today, they were hugely impactful on hundreds of thousands of people during the 19th century and for many generations subsequently, right up to our current moment throughout the Atlantic world. And third, they've usually been judged to be failures by contemporary historians because neither spawned a heroic and successful national independence struggle akin to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or the Haitian Revolution. When I looked into 19th century Liberia and Yucatan, I found actually a rich trove of documents that offered hints of a different kind of success, namely letters in which Maya people in Yucatan and formerly enslaved Black Americans in Liberia reflected deeply about what freedom could mean. Of course, Yucatecan Maya and former slaves from the US didn't have access to publishing houses or other print media, so they couldn't publish books or articles, but they did write these letters, and hundreds of them, to their family and friends, to their former masters, to their antagonists in war. And in those letters, the word or concept of freedom, or in Spanish, libertad, comes up a lot, constantly, as a way of, as a kind of name for what people wanted. But what they meant by freedom turns out to be quite different from what the Locke's, Rousseau's, or Jefferson's of the world meant by it. So I'm going to try to give you a glimpse of this 19th century quotidian, non-elite Black and Indigenous thought about the meaning of freedom in the hope that we might learn and think together from some new perspectives, which are, after all, very old perspectives on what freedom could name. So let's start with Liberia. Beginning in 1822, Liberia was colonized by thousands of Black settlers from the United States, most of whom were slaves who had been promised freedom if they agreed to be deported to West Africa and set up a colony. Those who made that promise and fueled the entire venture were white officials of a private philanthropy called the American Colonization Society, or ACS. ACS officials tended to be against slavery, but they were also white nationalists in that they did not want Black people in the United States. So their solution was emancipation, followed by deportation and the colonization of West Africa. It was they who named this place Liberia after the Latin libertas, or place of freedom. Of course, the actual territory that would become Liberia was neither free nor empty when Black Americans started arriving. It was actually the home of Native West Africans who had moved into the region at least as far back as the 13th century. By the 19th century, coastal ethno-linguistic groups such as the Kru, Bai, Day, Bassa, Gola, and Kisi had lived a lively and diverse culture. Some of these native West Africans had also long been active participants in the Atlantic slave trade, however. So who were these Black American settlers, these former slaves who were deported by the ACS to West Africa and told to make a free place called Liberia? Well, one way to know about them is to read their letters. So if you could show the next slide. Thank you. Here's one of those letters. On July 19th, 1858, a Black American settler in Liberia wrote this letter to the treasurer of the American Colonization Society, a man named William McLean. The letter is unsigned, so I can't say for sure who wrote it, though at some point someone, maybe an archivist, wrote the name McKay in pencil at the end of the letter, and the opening lines of the letter itself suggest that this may be the author's last name. At the top of the second page, crowded by the last lines of the letter, we learn its date and the apparent location of its drafting. G.C. Mount Robertsport, the town, or the town of Robertsport in Grand Cape Mount, the northernmost coastal region of Liberia bordering Sierra Leone. I came across this letter in the Library of Congress's American Colonization Society papers, which offer no other information about its author or context. But it conforms to many of the formal features of the hundreds of letters written by Black settlers in Liberia during the early to mid-19th century. It's written on the cheapest of paper from the period, which is thin and, as you can probably see, has a distinct blue color. It addresses a senior ACS official. It complains about poor conditions and requests material aid. And the author's lack of formal education is reflected in the unsteady penmanship, the phonetic spelling, and the lack of punctuation. So let's read this letter together. Could you show the next slide? I have a transcription of it because it's easier to read. Dear Sir, I've taken my pen in hand to let you know how we are. There is many of the McKay family are suffered to death. Mr. W. McLean, please to help us. We ought not to complain. They give us lots upon rocks, and I cannot get the hoe to the ground for rocks. And there is woman that 6 and 7 children settle on 1/4 of an acre of land. We have arrived there a year and cannot support ourselves. They do not give land enough. If corn would grow in Africa, they would be living. There's 8 head dead from the time we got off the ship, suffering gain, and it remain. Mr. McLean, our true friend, please send us provision that will give us a start. The $5 and all other money, use it in the house, the boxes, all the agent take them. Liberia is a dark, dark place. Flour is 12.5 cents a pound, meat 25 and 30 cents a pound, butter is 50 cents. Buying at that rate, it's dear. We have stir late and early. Robertsport, the town. The cart is no profit for running the hills, and mountain is so great. Valley, no coin of beast, cannot up and down the hills. Up great. We plant a root, it take 12. Okay, so how should we interpret this letter? Well, we could read it like most historians would, focusing on what it describes about how people were living in Liberia during the 19th century, what practical things they were doing in order to answer the questions historians usually ask about regular people from the past. Who did what, where, and when? So take this sentence from the McKay letter, for instance. Can you show the next slide? The top sentence there, they give us lots upon rocks, and I cannot get the hoe to the ground for rocks. If corn would grow in Africa, there would be living. The cart is no profit for running the hills, and the mountain is so great, valley no coin of beast, cannot up and down the hills. We could draw from this sentence a material sense of how difficult life in Liberia was for Black settlers from the US, who suffered to death due to an unfamiliar topography that was very unlike what they were used to in the kind of West Virginia or North Carolina region that they typically came from, and that thus did not prove amenable to the agricultural skills they brought with them. Or take the next sentence, flour is 12.5 cents a pound, meat 25, 30 cents a pound, butter is 50 cents, buying at that rate is dear. We could say this sentence offers a sense of the high cost of provisions, and we could add that those costs were probably exacerbated by the corruption of ACS officials in Liberia, mentioned in the next phrase. All other money, use it in the house, the boxes, all the agent take them. As well as those officials' failure to give settler families adequate sized plots, mentioned here. There is woman that 6 and 7 children settle on 1/4 of an acre of land. They do not give land enough. So we could, in turn, conclude that self-determination was lacking as the settlers struggled under the weight of ACS demands upon them. All of that would be correct, I think. But as I was researching the letters and reading them and thinking about them, it occurred to me that when we read the writings of the period's elites, the Locke's, Rousseau's, and Hegel's I mentioned at the beginning, we don't usually ask these kinds of questions. We don't ask where Hegel bought his newspapers, or what groceries Rousseau typically shopped for, or when Locke liked to get up in the morning, right? Instead, we immediately ask big theoretical questions, like what was their idea of freedom? What was their theory of freedom? So this prompted me to want to ask a kind of big question of a regular, barely literate person like McKay to read his letter as if it were a treatise on freedom. Because after all, this is a man who we can probably assume thought a lot about freedom, having been enslaved much of his life. I would even call him an expert on freedom. So what if we just assumed, like we do with Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, that he had a theory of freedom and read his letter as if it expressed that theory? Let me try that kind of interpretation of this letter here with you today. Can you show the next slide? Notice how in the middle of the letter, McKay seeks aid that will give us a start, he says. If he was told by the ACS that he would find freedom in Liberia, then he's here seeking to start being free. But when would the search for freedom end? And what would freedom look like once he got there or at that point? Can you show the next slide? McKay does not make that clear, or we might say he refuses to declare where he'll end his start, or what he will find and call freedom. In fact, he suggests that he has not even quite started to be free yet. I want to suggest that this is his way of saying that nothing the ACS envisioned as freedom is really free, and that in fact, freedom hasn't even begun in Liberia. It was supposed to be there waiting for him, and he says it hasn't even begun. It needs to start. In effect, McKay posits a kind of open-ended idea of freedom, one that needs to be improvised rather than pre-programmed, one that's ongoingly formed and reformed, one that's not a policy or a plan drawn up in the boardrooms of the ACS, but one that has to be put into action in new and constantly changing conditions. The structure of the letter echoes this kind of open-ended improvisational idea of freedom. Though it begins kind of formally with the phrase, "Dear Sir," you might have noticed that the letter ends mid-thought with the sentence fragment, "We plant a root, it take 12. So even formally, the letter has no symmetry of salutation and valediction. It refuses closure. It never kind of arrives at a final moment. Now, some might say that this is McKay's failing or failure, his illiteracy keeping him from formulating a full letter, much less a theory of freedom. I wouldn't say that, though, because the letter is remarkably complex in many other ways. Though it seems syntactically and grammatically irregular and incomplete, it's in fact precisely organized by alliteration. Consider these phrases. Can you show the next slide? Lots upon rocks, and I cannot get the hoe to the ground for rocks. Or there is 8 head dead from the time we got off the ship, suffering gain, and it remain, Mr. McLean. The quotidian rhythm of hoes endlessly striking rocks, and the rhyming of gain, remain, McLean, works with the letter's repetition of the phrase Liberia is a dark, dark place to give it a kind of sonic structure. All of this suggests that the letter sounds its way toward making sense of what Liberia has proven to be, a place where freedom has yet to begin. This sounding draws, no doubt, on an oral and biblical literacy that was common even among the least formally educated Black settlers from the United States. So if we grant the letter this kind of formal and textual complexity, we could see it not as a failure of language, but rather, on the one hand, as a refutation of the theories of the white officials of the American Colonization Society, and on the other, an alternative theory of open-ended, improvised freedom, a freedom yet to come. For McKay, then, freedom would not be something that arrives at a precise, punctual moment, say, upon emancipation from slavery or arrival in Africa. Indeed, both that emancipation and that arrival proved not very freeing for Black American settlers in Liberia, since they found themselves struggling just to survive amid 40% mortality rates from malaria and the realization that they were being asked to steal land from indigenous West Africans, who soon started to wage war against them. This letter tells us that freedom is not something that arrives here. It's not simply emancipation, and it's not simply colonization. It has yet to arrive, and so it has to start. It has to be improvised. McKay starts his letter by saying he's going to tell William McLean how we are in Liberia, the very place that McLean had been telling people like McKay would be their land of freedom. So what's his answer to the question of how we are? Could you show the next slide? Perhaps that can be found in the alliterative phrase, suffering gain and it remain. Formerly enslaved Black American settlers like McKay suffered what they putatively gained in Liberia. Being freed from slavery did not end their suffering. Colonization did not gain them wealth or liberty or independence. And yet, it remained. What remains? The very question of what freedom might mean, since none of McLean and the ACS's answers worked. I want to suggest that freedom emerges from this letter neither as an aim toward which one willfully and masterfully strives, or as a goal one sets and doggedly achieves, nor as an objective accomplished by ownership, citizenship, the accumulation of wealth, or the institutionalization of independence. McKay sweeps all that away, rejecting those definitions in a flurry of sonic structure. Rather, for McKay, freedom befalls and eludes, persisting as the remains of its ambivalent pursuit. Ever a question and a claim for and upon both McKay and us as readers of his unfinished letter. I want to insist that the author of the McKay letter was and is a theorist of freedom yet to come, a freedom Black people will have to improvise. Let me talk more briefly then about another example, this time from Yucatan in Mexico. So Spaniards had first colonized the region of Yucatan in the early 16th century, and their so-called Creole descendants had steadily dispossessed the Maya majority, securing tribute from them for the church and conscripting their labor for the brutal henequen and sugar industries. The Spaniards, who were known in Spanish as Yucatecos, Españoles, or Blancos, whites, or in Yucatec Maya as Tzulu'ob, had also imposed a sharp hierarchical caste system, or sistema de castas, on the population, dividing whites from Indians, from Blacks, and inventing scores of casta categories for every possible combination of those divisions. So a conflict flared up on July 26, 1847, when the Maya leader of a village of Chichimilá, whose name was Manuel Antonio I. Tec, was executed by Creole Yucatecan officials for supposedly conspiring to lead a Maya revolt against local leaders allied with the Creole state. On July 30, 1847, the Maya leader of the nearby village of Tepic, whose name was Cecilio Chi, responded to this crackdown on dissent, which he had spread to his own town, by leading a massacre of most of Tepic's Creole residents. He was soon joined by Jacinto Pat, the Maya leader of the neighboring villages of Tiosuco and Tela, in directing a large-scale uprising of the Maya majority against the ruling Creole minority that would last until 1901. The war was fought on the ground, often quite brutally, but it was also a written war, with Creoles using their newspapers and popular novels called folletines to cast the Maya as savages. For their part, the Maya wrote letters documenting their demands and making claims on the Creole state. Fascinatingly, the Maya rebels never sought strict separation or independence from Yucatan or Mexico. Rather, they consistently sought to renegotiate their place within that state on their own terms. One such letter was written on April 7th, 1850, by 7 Maya leaders from a small village called Has in the south of the peninsula to the Creole priest and commissioner Canuto Bella. This is what they wrote in part. And can you show the next slide? I'll read the English. The agreement made with us is clearly understood. For this we are fighting. That no tax will be paid by white, black, or Indian. 10 pesos for baptism for the white, for the black, and for the Indian. 10 pesos for weddings for the white, for the black, and for the Indian. As far as debts, that the old ones will not be paid by the white, nor the black, nor the Indian, and that it will not be necessary to buy land. The white, the black, or the Indian can plant their milpa wherever he wants, and no one will prohibit it. This letter calls for the end of unequal taxes, the cancellation of old debts, and free access to land for cultivation for all, where all means the white, the black, and the Indian, el blanco, el negro, y el indígena. These are the names for castes, or castas, imposed by the Creole state on people to divide and rank them. Fascinatingly, though, the rebels don't reject these castic labels. Rather, they seek to claim and redefine them. Can you show the next slide? By speaking for el blanco, el negro, y el indígena in the past, present, subjunctive, and future tenses, the letter casts the hierarchical legacy of the Yucatecan caste system into a future where difference would persist, but not mean inequality. The milpa is central here. Taken in its most narrow sense, a milpa is a field in which indigenous peasants plant corn, beans, and squash together to provide sustenance and to keep the soil enriched. More broadly, however, milpa was a name for a way of organizing economic, political, kinship, and gender relations on quotidian and seasonal scales that antagonize the kind of global capitalist development Yucatecan Creole sought to establish with the industrial production of sugar and henequen. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, Creoles effectively waged war against the milpa in an effort to expropriate indigenous land, to draw Maya away from milpa production, and push them into peonage or mass wage labor on henequen and sugar plantations. Consequently, the milpa has also long been a Creole name for supposedly stubborn and backward indigenous resistance to modernization. But in the letter from Rancho Has, the continual thriving of the milpa is rather the condition of possibility for ongoing Mayan participation in the Yucatecan state and the realization of universal libertad for whites, blacks, and Indians. This letter effectively casts casta into a future that's yet to be fully formed, a future in which those who've been excluded from or subject to Creole norms will continue to claim and rework those norms. So the milpa, which in Creole, the Creole idiom is antiquated, pre-modern, is actually the future for these Mayan rebels. So I hope to have given you a little taste here of how regular people theorized freedom in the 19th century by looking away from the treatises and books of the foundational figures of Western political theory and toward traces of Black and Indigenous theory in the 19th century Atlantic world, traces that can be found in letters organized by open ends rather than grand conclusions, by alliterative challenges to colonization, and by efforts to reclaim hierarchies as names for new commitments to future difference. And that's it.